My husband left everything to me. 6 months later, his son dragged me into court and called me a manipulative old woman who tricked a grieving widower out of his fortune. He hired the most feared attorney in the city to tear me apart in public. What neither of them understood was this. I had spent most of my life letting people underestimate me, and that mistake was about to cost them dearly. My name is Vivian Kensington. I'm 67 years old, and the first thing I felt that morning was the silence. Not peace, not calm, silence. The kind that settles into a house after someone dies and never really leaves again. Dominic had been gone 6 months, but every room still belonged to him. His reading glasses sat beside the recliner. His coat still hung by the back door because I hadn't found the strength to move it. Even the kitchen carried him somehow. I drank my coffee from the ceramic mug he gave me on our 15th anniversary and stared at the empty chair across from me, pretending this was still my life. Pretending I wasn't alone. Then the doorbell rang. The man outside couldn't have been older than 25. Cheap suit. Nervous smile. Legal envelope tucked under his arm. Mrs. Kensington? I need your signature. The second I saw the paperwork, my stomach dropped. Sebastian was contesting Dominic's will. I read the pages twice because my mind refused to accept the words. Manipulation. Undue influence. Financial coercion. It painted me like some desperate woman who trapped a lonely old man for money. By the time I reached the last page, my hands were shaking. I sat down in Dominic's leather chair and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to understand how 20 years of marriage had been reduced to accusations written in black ink. 20 years. I cooked for that family, cleaned for them, sat through illnesses, holidays, disappointments, surgeries, sleepless nights. I held Dominic's hand through every doctor appointment near the end when Sebastian couldn't be bothered to answer the phone. And now his son was calling me a predator. The courthouse felt cold in the way grief does. Cold marble. Echoing footsteps. Polished wood worn smooth by miserable people carrying miserable stories. I wore the same navy dress from Dominic's funeral because I still couldn't bring myself to buy something new. My purse felt too small in my hands. I remember gripping it tightly just to stop myself from trembling. Sebastian was already there. Perfect suit. Expensive watch. Hair slicked back like he was posing for a magazine cover instead of suing his dead father's widow. And that smile. That smug little smile he'd had since he was a teenager whenever he thought he'd won. Beside him sat Alexander Vale. Even I knew that name. People whispered it in town like it meant something dangerous. He was the attorney wealthy people hired when they wanted to destroy someone completely. The kind of attorney corporations paid thousands an hour to keep on retainer. The kind of man who could make an entire courtroom turn against you before you even opened your mouth. I had no lawyer. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find someone eventually. But deep down I knew the truth. Good attorneys cost money, and part of me still couldn't imagine stepping back into that world myself. All rise. Judge Blackwood entered with the tired expression of a man who'd spent years watching families destroy each other over money. The hearing began. Alexander Vale stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the center of the courtroom with total confidence. Your Honor, he began smoothly. We are here because an innocent man's final wishes were manipulated by a calculating woman who took advantage of his loneliness and declining health. Every word hit like a slap. He spoke calmly. Professionally. That made it worse. Because lies sound terrifying when delivered by someone who knows exactly how to sell them. Vale turned slightly toward me. Mrs. Kensington married the deceased after a remarkably brief courtship. She has no meaningful career history, no higher education, no independent financial standing. His eyes scanned the courtroom before landing back on the judge. She was, by all accounts, simply a housewife entirely dependent on Dominic Kensington for support. A few people in the gallery exchanged looks. I felt my face burn. Just a housewife. It's strange how quickly the world dismisses women once they pass a certain age. Especially women who spent their lives taking care of everyone else instead of collecting titles and promotions. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, satisfied. I looked at him and suddenly remembered the little boy he used to be. The stubborn 12-year-old who refused to eat vegetables unless I covered them in cheese sauce. The teenager who slammed doors so hard the walls rattled. The boy I sat beside during school plays, even when he pretended not to see me in the audience. I had tried. God knows I tried. But Sebastian only loved people when he needed something from them. Furthermore, Vale continued, Mrs. Kensington systematically isolated the deceased from his only son in order to secure control over an estate valued at $8.5 million. The number stirred the room. But I barely heard it. Because to me, Dominic was never a number. He was the man who brought me tea when I had migraines. The man who danced badly in the kitchen. The man who held my hand during thunderstorms because he knew I hated them. Judge Blackwood folded his hands. And your evidence, Mr. Vale? Vale nodded confidently. We have phone records, witness testimony, and statements from neighbors indicating Mrs. Kensington actively discouraged contact between father and son during the final years of Mr. Kensington's life. I nearly stood up right there. Discouraged contact? Sebastian stopped visiting because he only came when he wanted money. Those phone calls they mentioned? Most of them were me begging him to come see his father while Dominic was dying. Begging. But none of that sounded impressive in legal language. How do you prove loyalty in a courtroom? How do you explain 20 years of devotion to strangers who only understand documents and signatures? Vale walked slowly past the judge's bench, building momentum like a performer reaching the climax of a show. This is a textbook case of elder manipulation, he said. A woman with no real skills, no meaningful education, and no financial independence attached herself to a vulnerable widower and pushed away his rightful heir. Then Sebastian finally spoke. And the moment he opened his mouth, I realized he truly believed I was weak. She's just a housewife. Sebastian actually laughed when he said it. The sound bounced across the courtroom, sharp and ugly, and for a second even the clerk stopped typing. Your Honor, look at her, he continued. She can barely manage her own finances. You really expect this woman to understand my father's estate? She probably doesn't even know what half those assets are worth. A few people lowered their eyes. Others stared at me openly now, like they were trying to decide whether I looked greedy enough. Judge Blackwood stayed composed, but I noticed the brief pause before he spoke. Mrs. Kensington, he said carefully, do you have legal representation? I rose slowly. My knees didn't feel steady anymore. No, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself. Sebastian smirked immediately. The judge made a note. And how do you respond to the allegations made against you today? My mouth went dry. Not because I didn't understand the courtroom, because I hadn't stood inside one in nearly 20 years. How was I supposed to explain 20 years of marriage in a courtroom built for arguments instead of truth? How do you summarize a life together into a few sentences strangers can understand? Your Honor, I said quietly, I loved my husband. My voice shook at first, but I kept going. I cared for him every day. Through surgeries, appointments, long nights when he couldn't sleep. I never married Dominic for money. I never asked him for anything except honesty and kindness. Sebastian gave a short, mocking laugh. Of course not. That's why you married a man 23 years older than you. I looked directly at him. I married Dominic because he treated me with respect, I said. Because after my first marriage failed, he showed me what a good man actually looks like. For the first time all morning, Sebastian's smile faded slightly. Alexander Vale stepped in before the moment could settle. Your Honor, we have witnesses prepared to testify that Mrs. Kensington frequently discussed inheriting the deceased's wealth. In fact, a neighbor overheard her speaking about the will only weeks before Mr. Kensington's death. My stomach tightened instantly. Mrs. Park. She'd found me crying on my porch after Dominic's diagnosis. The doctor had given him 6 months. I remembered sitting there shaking so hard I could barely breathe while Mrs. Park wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I had been terrified of losing him, terrified of waking up alone again. But in court, grief can be twisted into motive. Judge Blackwood checked the clock on the wall. We'll adjourn for today and resume tomorrow morning at 9. He looked at me over his glasses. Mrs. Kensington, I strongly encourage you to seek legal counsel. The room emptied slowly after that. Sebastian and Vale stayed behind near their table, talking quietly. Then Sebastian laughed again, relaxed now, confident. Like the case was already over. I remained seated for a long moment, staring at the polished floor while humiliation settled over me like wet cement. Gold digger. Manipulator. Just a housewife. That was all they saw. Not the woman who kept Dominic alive through the hardest years of his illness. Not the woman who held his hand when the pain medication stopped working. Not the woman who stayed. Just a convenient stereotype in sensible shoes. But somewhere beneath the hurt, something else started waking up. Something old. Something I hadn't touched in years. By the time I reached home, my chest felt tight with anger I didn't quite recognize anymore. Dominic's study still smelled like cedar and coffee. His law books lined the walls exactly the way he liked them, organized by subject and then alphabetically because he insisted there was no other civilized way to do it. Framed photographs sat across the shelves beside them. Bellariva, Beaumont, Silverpine State during our last anniversary trip, when we spent 3 days snowed in together laughing like newlyweds. I poured myself a glass of the Merlot Dominic had been saving for a special occasion. Funny how life decides those for you. I sat alone in the dim light replaying every second of that courtroom. The way Sebastian looked at me with contempt. The way Vale dismissed me before I even spoke. Just a housewife. I whispered the words aloud this time, and suddenly they tasted wrong. Because I hadn't always been just a housewife. Once long before Dominic I had my own office. My own clients. My own reputation. Once people stood up when I entered a room. I stared at the shelves of legal books and memories began pushing through years of quiet domestic life like sunlight through cracked curtains. That woman still existed somewhere. I just hadn't needed her in a very long time. The phone rang. I ignored it. It rang again immediately. Then again. Finally I answered. Mrs. Kensington? Camille Laurent, Crown 8 Network. We understand you're involved in a high-profile inheritance dispute. Would you care to comment on accusations that you manipulated your late husband? I hung up. The phone rang again before I could even set it down. By the fourth call I unplugged it from the wall completely. So Sebastian had already started feeding the story to the media. Tomorrow my face would probably be splashed across morning television beside words like greedy widow and family betrayal. I climbed the stairs slowly and stopped in front of the bedroom mirror. Gray hair tied neatly back. Fine lines around my eyes. Simple dress. Soft shoes. I looked exactly like the woman Sebastian described in court. A harmless older widow with no idea what she was doing. I opened my jewelry box to put away my wedding ring for the night. That's when my fingers brushed against something cold beneath the velvet lining. A key. Small. Brass. Familiar. I froze. Dominic's desk drawer. The locked one. Years ago, he'd handed me the key with a strange smile. For emergencies, he'd said. For the day you need to remember who you really are. At the time, I thought he was being sentimental. Now, standing alone in that silent bedroom, I realized he'd known something I didn't. My hands trembled as I walked back downstairs. The study felt different suddenly. Heavier. Waiting. I slid the key into the drawer lock and turned it slowly. The drawer opened with a quiet click. Inside was a thick manila folder. Across the tab in Dominic's handwriting were 2 words. Vivi Personal. My pulse quickened before I even touched it. The first thing I pulled out was my law degree. Kingsley School of Law. Summa cum laude. I stared at the paper so long the room blurred around me. Underneath it were newspaper clippings I hadn't seen in decades. Headlines about major cases. Interviews. Articles discussing my rulings like they mattered to the future of the state. Then came the photograph. Me standing in judicial robes while cameras flashed around me. Judge Vivian Laurent. Youngest Superior Court judge in state history. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. More documents followed. Letters from attorneys whose names still carried weight in legal circles. Commendations. Speaking invitations. Awards I barely remembered earning. And at the very bottom was a folded handwritten note. Dominic's handwriting always leaned slightly to the left. My dearest Vivi, I know you sacrificed so much to build a life with me, but your gifts were never lost. They were only resting until the day you needed them again. You are the strongest and most brilliant woman I have ever known. Don't let anyone, not even our son, make you forget that. All my love. Dominic. The tears came before I could stop them. Not soft tears. The kind that break loose after months of holding yourself together because everyone else expects you to. Dominic knew. All these years he knew exactly what I had given up. and he never pitied me for it. I sat there clutching that letter while memories I had buried for 2 decades came rushing back all at once. Courtrooms. Arguments. The sharp tension before a verdict. Lawyers scrambling when I questioned them because they realized too late they hadn't prepared well enough. Before I became Dominic's wife, I had spent 15 years on the bench as Judge Vivian Laurent. Some people in the legal world used to call me the Iron Judge. Not because I was cruel, because I couldn't be manipulated. I handled corporate litigation, criminal trials, inheritance disputes worth millions. Attorneys twice my age dreaded appearing in my courtroom unprepared. Then I met Dominic. It was at a charity gala in 2003. He was recently widowed and looked completely exhausted by grief. Sebastian was 12 then, angry, withdrawn, hurting in ways boys that age don't know how to explain. Dominic didn't know who I was professionally when we met. To him I was just Vivi, the woman who made him laugh again. And for the first time in my entire career, I wanted something more than the law. I wanted a family. So I stepped away. Officially, I retired early due to burnout. Unofficially, I traded courtrooms for dinner tables and legal briefs for grocery lists. I became a wife, a stepmother, the steady person holding everything together behind the scenes while Dominic continued building his empire. And for years I truly believed I'd left that part of myself behind forever. But sitting in that study, surrounded by evidence of the woman I used to be, I realized something important. She wasn't gone. She'd just been quiet. I opened my laptop. Dominic spent years trying to convince me technology wouldn't kill me. I mostly used the thing for recipes and emails, but that night my fingers moved differently. Fast. Certain. Familiar. I searched inheritance law, undue influence standards, probate precedent, evidentiary burdens. Within an hour, I already saw the cracks in Sebastian's case. Alexander Vale wasn't building a legal argument. He was building a performance. He had emotion, optics, sympathy, but very little evidence. No proof Dominic lacked mental capacity. No documentation of coercion. No financial irregularities. Nothing concrete. Just a bitter son hoping a courtroom would emotionally punish the woman he blamed for losing his father. But courtrooms are dangerous places when emotion runs into facts. And facts had always been my specialty. I stayed in Dominic's study most of the night reviewing documents. This time not as a grieving widow. As an attorney. As a judge. The will was airtight. Proper witnesses. Proper notarization. Multiple revisions over the years proving consistency in Dominic's intentions. Then I found records from Dominic's financial advisor. Detailed notes. Conversations about Sebastian's reckless spending. His unpaid debts. His constant requests for money. Dominic had been worried for years. And then I found something even more important. Dominic's journal. Page after page written during his final months. Not about money. About me. About us. About how afraid he was to leave me alone with Sebastian's resentment. One entry stopped me cold. Vivi still thinks she gave up everything for me. She doesn't realize how proud I've always been of the life she had before we met. If Sebastian tries to hurt her after I'm gone, he's going to discover something I never forgot. My wife is far stronger than anyone realizes. I read that paragraph 3 times. By the end, my hands weren't trembling anymore. Neither was my voice. I closed the journal slowly and looked around the room. This wasn't just Dominic's study. It was a war room now. And tomorrow, I would not walk back into court as a frightened widow defending herself against cruel accusations. I would walk in as Judge Vivian Laurent. Sebastian thought I was weak because I had spent 20 years loving his father quietly. Alexander Vale thought a modest dress and gray hair meant incompetence. Neither of them understood the danger of humiliating someone who already survived an entire lifetime before they met you. Morning arrived cold and bright. I wore the same navy dress. But this time I stood a little straighter when I put it on. My posture was different the second day. Straighter. Steadier. The same navy dress, the same sensible shoes, the same quiet widow everyone underestimated. But underneath, the woman I used to be had returned. Sebastian and Alexander Vale were already seated when I entered the courtroom. Vale looked relaxed, casually flipping through documents like a man reviewing paperwork for a deal already finished. Sebastian looked even happier. Every now and then he glanced toward me with that same smug expression, like I was some confused old woman wandering into the wrong room. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Judge Blackwood entered precisely on time. This time I studied him more carefully. The measured walk. The controlled tone. The habit of rereading notes before speaking. He reminded me of young attorneys I used to see years ago, the serious ones who prepared obsessively but still feared making a mistake in front of the bench. "Mr. Vale," the judge said, "call your first witness." Vale rose smoothly. "The plaintiff calls Mrs. Genevieve Park." My stomach tightened. Mrs. Park looked uncomfortable the moment she sat down. We'd been neighbors for 8 years. I brought her soup after her surgery. Dominic fixed her mailbox after a storm tore it loose. We exchanged Christmas cookies every December. But now she avoided my eyes completely. Vale approached her gently like he was helping instead of using her. "Mrs. Park, how well did you know Dominic Kensington?" "He was a very kind man," she answered softly. "And did you observe tension between Dominic and his son in recent years?" "A little," she admitted. "Sebastian didn't visit much." Vale nodded knowingly. "Did Mrs. Kensington ever discuss this with you?" "Sometimes." "And can you tell the court about the conversation you had with her approximately 2 months before Dominic's death?" There it was. I already knew exactly which conversation he meant. Mrs. Park swallowed hard. "I found her crying on the porch after Dominic's diagnosis," she said quietly. "She told me she was scared about what would happen after he died. She said she'd given up everything for him, and that Sebastian might try to take it all away." The courtroom fell silent. Vale let the moment breathe. "Did she mention the will?" "She said Dominic promised to take care of her," Mrs. Park answered. "But she didn't think Sebastian would respect that." Vale turned toward the judge with quiet satisfaction. No further questions. Sebastian looked pleased with himself, like they had just delivered the final blow. Judge Blackwood turned to me. "Mrs. Kensington, would you like to cross-examine the witness?" I stood calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." The heels of my shoes clicked softly against the courtroom floor as I approached the witness stand. Mrs. Park looked nervous now. Not because she feared me. Because for the first time, she sensed something wasn't matching the story Vale had built. "Mrs. Park," I said gently, "you testified that I was crying during this conversation." "Yes." "Can you remind the court why I was crying?" She blinked surprised. "Because Dominic was dying." "Specifically," I continued, "what had we learned that morning?" Vale stood immediately. "Objection." "I'll allow it," Judge Blackwood interrupted. Mrs. Park shifted in her seat. "The doctors told you the treatments had stopped working. They said he had maybe 6 weeks left." I nodded slowly. 6 weeks, I repeated quietly. The courtroom stayed completely still. "Mrs. Park, in your honest opinion, was I crying because I feared losing money?" Her answer came instantly. "No." She realized too late how quickly she'd said it. I took one small step closer. "Then why was I crying?" "Because you were losing your husband." The silence afterward felt heavier than before. "And when I said I was afraid of what would happen after Dominic died," I asked softly, "did I say I was afraid of being poor?" Mrs. Park looked down. "No." "What did I say?" "You said," her voice trembled slightly, "you said you didn't know how to live without him." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. I nodded once. "Thank you, Mrs. Park." No further questions. As she stepped down from the witness stand, I caught Judge Blackwood studying me carefully. Not casually anymore. Carefully. Because helpless women do not cross-examine witnesses like that. Vale called the next witness quickly, trying to regain momentum. Dominic's banker testified about large financial transfers during Dominic's final months. Vale framed them as suspicious. But once cross-examination began, the story changed. "Mr. Whitmore," I said evenly, "isn't it true those transfers were part of a long-term estate reorganization plan?" The banker hesitated. "Yes." "And wasn't the purpose to simplify financial management for me after Dominic's passing?" "Yes." "So Dominic was preparing his affairs responsibly. I suppose that's fair. Not manipulation. Preparation." The next witness was a former law colleague of Dominic's who claimed Dominic had seemed confused near the end of his life. Vale clearly thought he had something there. Until I questioned him. You testified Dominic seemed confused during your final phone call? Yes. Do you recall what you discussed? The man frowned slightly. A client matter. And was Dominic confused? I asked carefully. Or angry about mistakes your firm had made handling that client? The witness paused too long. Then sighed. He was frustrated. With your firm? Yes. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Vale stopped looking comfortable after that. Not panicked yet, but alert. Meanwhile, Sebastian still sat there convinced this was temporary. Convinced I'd eventually crack. By lunch recess, the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. People were no longer looking at me with pity. Now they were trying to figure me out. Judge Blackwood removed his glasses while reviewing his notes. You're handling yourself remarkably well, Mrs. Kensington, he said quietly. Thank you, Your Honor. Then he looked up again. One question before recess. Something in his tone changed. What is your full legal name? The air left my lungs. For a second, the courtroom disappeared. I heard Dominic's voice in my head. She's going to surprise everyone. I swallowed slowly. This was the moment everything changed. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath waiting for my answer. I could feel Sebastian staring at me. Alexander Vale too. Neither of them expected this question to matter. Vivian Kensington, I said calmly. Though I've gone by Vivi for many years. Judge Blackwood's pen stopped moving. Slowly he looked up at me. Vivian Kensington, he repeated carefully. As in Judge Vivian Laurent? Sebastian turned so fast his chair scraped the floor. What? Vale's expression changed instantly. The confidence disappeared from his face. I was Judge Vivian Laurent, I said quietly. I retired 20 years ago. Back then, I practiced under my first married name, Laurent. After I married Dominic, I stepped away from public life almost completely. Sebastian stood up completely. That's impossible. You're just a housewife. I finished for him. His mouth snapped shut. Yes, I said softly. I heard you yesterday. Vale leaned toward Sebastian immediately, whispering so fast the words blurred together. Both of them suddenly looked less like hunters and more like men realizing they'd stepped into the wrong fight. Judge Blackwood was still staring at me. Not with pity anymore. Recognition. Respect. And maybe a little disbelief. Your Honor, Vale said tightly, struggling to recover. This is the first we've heard of any legal background. We request time to. To what? Judge Blackwood interrupted sharply. I suggest counsel exercise greater caution before making assumptions about opposing parties. Vale's face drained of color. We conducted standard background checks. It appears the investigation was incomplete, the judge replied. I almost smiled. After I retired, I took my husband's name and stepped away from public life, I explained. But my law license remained active. I continued my continuing education requirements. Very few people connected Dominic Kensington's quiet widow to the woman who once dominated state courtrooms under a different name. Then I looked directly at Vale. I am fully qualified to represent myself. Sebastian looked physically ill now. Like the floor beneath him had disappeared. Judge Blackwood sat back slowly. Judge Laurent, he said formally. I appeared in your courtroom several times early in my career. I recognized the tone immediately. The careful respect lawyers use around judges who once terrified them. You were formidable. A small smile touched my lips. I tried to be fair. You were fair, he said. And extremely well prepared. Vale looked like he wanted the day erased from history. Judge Blackwood turned toward him. Mr. Vale, I suggest you use the lunch recess to reconsider your strategy. The gavel struck. Court resumes at 1:30. As the room emptied, I remained seated for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. For 20 years, I had buried Judge Vivian Laurent beneath grocery lists and dinner parties and quiet domestic routines. Now she was awake again, sharper than she had been in years. Sebastian stormed toward my table the second the judge disappeared. This is insane, he snapped. You can't be a judge. Judges don't just become housewives. I looked up at him calmly. Not as his stepmother. Not as the woman who spent 20 years trying to earn his approval. As someone who had spent most of her career dissecting dishonest people for a living, some people choose love over status, Sebastian, I said quietly. I never regretted that choice. That doesn't mean they become weak. His jaw tightened. You lied to us. No, I replied. I simply stopped introducing myself by my accomplishments. Behind him, Vale was already on his phone speaking urgently to someone, probably searching my old cases, probably discovering exactly how badly he'd misjudged me. For the first time since Dominic died, I felt something besides grief. For the first time since Dominic died, I felt focused again, purposeful, alive. By the time court resumed that afternoon, the atmosphere had completely changed. People stared openly now when I entered. Whispers followed me through the hallway. Apparently news traveled fast in legal circles, especially when a retired judge walked back into a courtroom disguised as the harmless widow everyone underestimated. Sebastian looked drained. Vale looked cautious. But Judge Blackwood's attitude changed the most. Yesterday he spoke to me gently, almost protectively. Now he addressed me like a colleague. Before we proceed, he said once court resumed, I need clarification. Judge Laurent, do you intend to continue representing yourself? I stood slowly, and for the first time in 2 decades, I felt that old authority settle naturally into place, like putting on a coat that still fit perfectly after years in storage. Yes, Your Honor, I said evenly. I believe I'm qualified to continue. Quiet laughter moved through the courtroom. Even Judge Blackwood almost smiled. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Then he turned toward Vale. Mr. Vale, would you like to proceed? Vale adjusted his tie. Barely. Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Sebastian Kensington. Now things were about to become interesting. I had watched Sebastian lie for 20 years. To teachers. To girlfriends. To business partners. To his father. And most of all to himself. But he had never faced cross-examination from someone trained to detect deception for a living. Sebastian took the stand trying to look confident, but I noticed every small crack immediately. The stiff shoulders. The dry swallowing. The way he avoided looking directly at me for too long. Vale guided him carefully through rehearsed testimony. Sebastian described feeling pushed away from his father after Dominic married me. He spoke about isolation, manipulation, emotional distance. He painted himself as the abandoned son replaced by a younger woman. A compelling story. If you didn't know him. Vale finished confidently. No further questions. Judge Blackwood turned toward me, and for the first time that day Sebastian finally looked afraid. In your opinion, Vale asked dramatically, did Mrs. Kensington intentionally interfere with your relationship with your father? Absolutely, Sebastian said without hesitation. His confidence started returning the longer he talked. Sebastian always loved being the center of attention. She was constantly hovering, he continued, always inserting herself into everything. She made it clear I wasn't welcome in my own father's house. Vale nodded sympathetically. Can you give the court an example? Sebastian leaned forward slightly, warming to the performance. Last Christmas, I came to stay for 3 days, and she made sure every minute was controlled. Shopping trips, dinner parties with her friends, holiday movies she wanted to watch. Every time I tried to speak privately with my dad, she interrupted. And how did that make you feel? Like she was afraid to leave us alone together. It was a convincing story. Emotional, personal, carefully polished. And if I were still the broken widow from 2 days earlier, it probably would have rattled me badly. But that woman was gone now. Your witness, Judge Blackwood said. I stood slowly and walked toward Sebastian. He tried to look relaxed, but I noticed his fingers tightening around the armrest of the witness chair. Sebastian, I began evenly, you testified that you visited your father for 3 days last Christmas. Correct. Yes. And before that visit, when was the previous time you saw him? A pause. I don't remember exactly. Perhaps I can help. I lifted a document from my folder. Your father kept detailed personal calendars. According to his records, your last in-person visit before Christmas occurred 14 months earlier. Sebastian shifted in his seat. We talked on the phone. How often? Regularly. I nodded thoughtfully. Sebastian, I'm handing you your father's phone records, already entered into evidence. Can you tell the court how many times you called him during the final 6 months of his life? He stared at the paper too long. These records might not. They're complete, I said calmly. His face reddened. The answer is 3 times. 3 phone calls in 6 months. None longer than 10 minutes. Vale stood immediately. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, Judge Blackwood replied, though his tone carried almost no criticism. Please rephrase. A familiar rhythm settled into me then. Question. Pause. Pressure. The dance of courtroom control I used to know by instinct. Sebastian, I said. Would you personally describe 3 calls in 6 months as a close relationship? He looked cornered already. We had a complicated relationship. Yes, I replied softly. I believe you did. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Now we were getting somewhere. You also testified that I planned activities to prevent private conversations between you and your father. Yes. Let's discuss those activities one at a time. Sebastian swallowed. You mentioned shopping trips. Do you remember what we were shopping for? No. The trip was for your father's medication. We drove 30 miles because only one pharmacy could prepare his pain treatment correctly. Sebastian said nothing. You also referenced dinner parties. Plural. He avoided my eyes now. In reality, I continued, there was one dinner gathering. A surprise celebration for your father's 70th birthday. I paused deliberately. The birthday you forgot until I reminded you. A murmur moved quietly through the courtroom. And the movies? Sebastian rubbed his jaw nervously. I don't know. They were films from the 1940s. Your father's favorites. I let the silence stretch. Were you aware your father suffered severe hearing loss near the end of his life? Sebastian blinked. No. So when I remained near your conversations, is it possible I was helping him hear you? Complete silence. Even Vale stopped moving. Several people in the courtroom leaned forward now. Not because of me. Because Sebastian suddenly sounded less like an abandoned son, and more like a man who barely knew his father during his final years. I softened my tone slightly. You also testified that I made you feel unwelcome in your father's home. Yes. Where did you sleep during that Christmas visit? In my old bedroom. The bedroom I spent 3 weeks preparing for you? Sebastian froze. The room where I rehung your baseball trophies because Dominic said you loved them as a teenager. The room where I placed fresh towels, snacks you liked, and extra blankets because you always complained the guest rooms were cold. Sebastian looked down. I don't remember. Of course he didn't. People rarely remember kindness they've already decided to resent. Did I ever once forbid you from visiting your father? No. Did I ever refuse to cook meals you liked? No. Did I exclude you from family holidays, photographs, birthdays, or celebrations? His voice dropped lower each time. No. The courtroom had changed sides now. I could feel it. Not sympathy. Understanding. I stepped closer to the witness stand. Sebastian, I asked gently, is it possible your anger toward me began long before I ever entered your life? Vale jumped up again. Objection. Calls for speculation. I gave the smallest nod. Withdrawn. Then I looked directly at Sebastian. When you were 12 years old and I married your father, what did you call me? His eyes widened immediately. I don't remember. But he did remember. We both did. You called me the replacement, I said quietly. Sebastian stared at me in silence. And when your father asked you to be kinder to me, you told him. I paused briefly. She'll never be my real mother, so why should I pretend to like her? The courtroom went completely still. One woman seated in the gallery lowered her eyes and wiped at them quickly. Sebastian looked trapped now. Not angry. Not arrogant. Exposed. I'm not saying this to humiliate you, I continued gently. I need this court to understand something very important. My voice softened. For 20 years I tried to earn your love. I never tried to steal your father's. Sebastian's face crumpled suddenly. The tears came hard and fast. The kind people can't fake no matter how much they want sympathy. You don't understand, he choked out. He loved you more than he ever loved me. There it was. Not greed. Not really. The wound underneath everything. He loved you more than he loved my mother, Sebastian whispered. I felt my chest tighten despite everything. Sebastian, I said quietly, love doesn't work like money. He looked up at me through tears. Your father loving me never meant he loved you less. For a moment he looked 12 years old again instead of 40. Just a hurt little boy who never recovered after losing his mother. Judge Blackwood watched silently, almost stunned by what the courtroom had become. Not a legal fight anymore. A family finally saying things out loud after decades of silence. But grief didn't erase facts. And Sebastian needed to hear them. You are not here because you miss your father, I said softly. You're here because you want what he left behind. Sebastian looked down immediately. So let me ask you one final question. My voice stayed calm. In the week before your father died, I called you 6 times asking you to come home. Sebastian's shoulders tightened. Why didn't you come? His crying worsened instantly. I was busy. Busy where? Silence. I answered for him. You were in Montera City. Vale started shuffling papers desperately. Too late. With your girlfriend, I continued. Gambling with money your father had sent you for rent. Sebastian closed his eyes. Everyone in the courtroom watched him now. Not me. Him. While your father was dying, I said quietly, he asked for you every single day. My throat tightened briefly, but I pushed through it. He kept thinking maybe you were stuck at the airport. Maybe your phone battery died. Maybe something terrible happened. Sebastian broke down completely. And all that time, I said, he never realized you simply chose not to come. So when you stand here and say I turned your father against you, I said carefully, remember something. I held his gaze. You did that yourself. Sebastian bent forward, sobbing into his hands. Not performative tears anymore. Real shame. Real grief. The kind that arrives too late to fix anything. Judge Blackwood called for a short recess, but everyone already knew what had happened. Everyone in the courtroom already understood where this was heading. As people filed out quietly, Alexander Vale approached my table. For the first time since this started, he looked nervous around me. Judge Laurent, he said carefully, perhaps we should discuss a settlement. I looked up slowly. 24 hours earlier, this man had publicly called me an uneducated gold digger. Now he sounded like a student hoping for mercy from a professor. Mr. Vale, I said calmly, yesterday you questioned my intelligence, my integrity, and my marriage. He swallowed hard. We may have been overly aggressive. Perhaps. He hesitated. So you're willing to negotiate? I leaned back slightly. No. His face fell. I'm no longer interested in settlement discussions, I said. I'm interested in justice. Then I gave him the same cold look that used to terrify attorneys decades ago. And I've always been very good at finding it. Vale walked away looking defeated. Not because he lost the case. Because he finally understood who he'd chosen to attack. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed before proceedings even started. People stared openly when I walked through the halls now. Attorneys whispered to each other. Some nodded respectfully as I passed. Apparently the return of Judge Vivian Laurent had become overnight legal gossip across half the city. Most younger attorneys had only heard stories about her. By the time she disappeared from public life, half the people in that courthouse were still in law school. Sebastian looked exhausted when I entered the courtroom. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His eyes were swollen and bloodshot like he hadn't slept at all. Good. Some truths deserve a sleepless night. Vale looked worse. Like a man preparing for professional humiliation. Judge Blackwood entered and surveyed the room carefully. Before we continue, he began, I believe yesterday's developments deserve acknowledgement. We learned that Mrs. Kensington previously served as Superior Court Judge Vivian Laurent, known throughout this state for her integrity and distinguished legal career. I noticed several younger attorneys sitting in the back now just to watch. Mr. Vale, the judge continued, do you wish to make any motions? Vale stood slowly. Gone was the swagger. Gone was the arrogance. Your Honor, he said. The plaintiff moves to dismiss all allegations regarding manipulation and undue influence. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Vale continued carefully. After further review, we acknowledge our conclusions regarding Mrs. Kensington's character may have been incorrect. 24 hours ago, hearing that would have satisfied me. But something changed overnight. This case stopped being only about Dominic's money. It became about every woman who ever sacrificed her own ambitions for family only to be treated like she accomplished nothing. Every woman dismissed as just a wife, just a widow, just a housewife. I stood before Vale could sit back down. Your Honor, I said clearly, I object to dismissal. Judge Blackwood lifted an eyebrow immediately. Mrs. Kensington, Judge Blackwood said carefully, the plaintiff is attempting to withdraw the case in your favor. Are you objecting to winning? I stood slowly. No, Your Honor, I said. I'm objecting to ending this without the truth being fully entered into the record. I turned slightly toward Vale and Sebastian. These men publicly accused me of manipulating my husband, stealing from his family, and exploiting a dying man. They questioned my integrity, my marriage, and my character. My voice remained calm. I believe this court deserves to hear all the evidence before this matter ends. Judge Blackwood studied me for several long seconds. Then I saw it. Recognition. Not of my identity this time. Of my purpose. He remembered exactly what kind of judge I used to be. Very well, he said at last. You may proceed. I had spent the entire night preparing. Not emotionally. Strategically. Your Honor, I said. I called Dominic Kensington. The courtroom erupted into confused murmurs. Vale shot upright immediately. Objection. The witness is deceased. Dominic Kensington himself is unavailable, I replied evenly. But his testimony is not. That shut the room down instantly. I walked toward the bailiff carrying the tablet I'd found hidden deep inside Dominic's computer files the night before. The recording was made in the presence of his estate attorney and notarized as part of his probate documentation. My husband anticipated this challenge, I explained. The statement was recorded 3 months before his death and satisfies probate evidentiary requirements under state law. Sebastian went pale before the screen even turned on. Then Dominic appeared. Thin from illness. Tired. But unmistakably sharp. The second his voice filled the courtroom, every person stopped moving. My name is Dominic Kensington, the recording began, and I am of sound mind as I record this statement on March 15, 2024. His breathing was slower than I remembered. But his eyes were steady. I am making this recording because I believe my son Sebastian may contest my will after my death. Sebastian lowered his head immediately. And if he does, Dominic continued, he will likely try to blame my wife. I felt my chest tighten hearing his voice again. Not weak. Not confused. Certain. Let me be absolutely clear, Dominic said. Vivi never manipulated me. Every decision regarding my estate was made by me alone. I know my son, Dominic continued. I know his habits, his weaknesses, and his relationship with money better than anyone. Then Dominic looked directly into the camera, and somehow it felt like he was staring straight at Sebastian through the screen. Sebastian, he said softly, if you're watching this, I need you to hear something honestly. Sebastian's shoulders began shaking. I have always loved you. The pain in Dominic's voice nearly broke me. But loving someone does not mean ignoring the truth. Sebastian covered his face. I have rescued you financially 17 times in 10 years. I have paid debts, rent, legal fees, and gambling losses. Vale closed his eyes briefly. You have wasted opportunities most people would beg for, Dominic continued. And worst of all, you treated the woman who loved you like family with cruelty she never deserved. Sebastian started crying again. Quietly this time. Not dramatic. Just broken. Vivi sacrificed more for this family than you ever understood, Dominic said. Then his voice softened. She was Judge Vivian Laurent, one of the finest legal minds this state ever produced. A ripple moved through the courtroom. She gave up that life willingly because she loved me. I felt tears threatening again, but I stayed still. She cared for you. Defended you. Cooked your meals. Supported your father when you wouldn't answer the phone. Dominic paused for breath. I am leaving my estate to Vivi because she earned it. Through loyalty. Through sacrifice. Through love. Several people in the gallery openly wiped tears away. Even the court reporter looked emotional. She held my hand through surgeries, through chemotherapy, through fear. Dominic smiled faintly then. And she never once made me feel like a burden. Sebastian looked completely destroyed. Then came the final part. Sebastian, Dominic said gently, your anger toward Vivi was never truly about her. You were grieving your mother. And instead of healing, you chose resentment. Dominic's eyes looked tired now. But that is not Vivi's fault. The screen went black. No one spoke. Not immediately. Judge Blackwood finally cleared his throat. Mr. Vale, he asked quietly, do you wish to cross-examine the testimony? Vale looked like he had aged 10 years sitting at that table. No, Your Honor. Not even an attempt. I returned calmly to my seat and lifted the thick folder beside me. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I also have additional supporting evidence. Sebastian stared blankly at the table now. I have financial records showing Sebastian Kensington borrowed approximately $137,000 from his father over 15 years without repayment. Vale didn't object. I have employment documentation showing repeated terminations for absenteeism and misconduct. Still no objection. And I have witness statements confirming Sebastian typically contacted his father only when requesting money. Every word settled heavier than the last. But then I lifted the final item. Dominic's journal. Leather-worn, soft from use. The room focused on it immediately. But more importantly, I said quietly, I have this. I held the journal carefully in both hands. The private thoughts of a dying man who knew exactly what kind of storm would come after he was gone. My husband's private journal, I said, holding it carefully, contains his personal thoughts during the final year of his life. The courtroom stayed silent. Not the thoughts of a manipulated man, I continued. The thoughts of a father heartbroken by his son's choices and terrified of what would happen to his wife after he was gone. Sebastian was openly crying now, not trying to hide it anymore. 20 years of anger and self-pity had finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. Your Honor, I said steadily, this case was never truly about money. I looked around the courtroom. It was about grief that hardened into resentment. About entitlement disguised as injustice. Then I looked directly at Sebastian. I tried to love you for 20 years. His face twisted painfully. I wasn't perfect, I admitted. But I never stopped trying. The room felt impossibly still. Your father left me his estate because he trusted me to protect what he built and honor the life we shared. I let that settle. You challenged his wishes not because you were cheated, but because you felt cheated. Judge Blackwood leaned forward. Mrs. Kensington, he said carefully, what exactly are you requesting from this court? I drew a slow breath. For the first time in years I felt fully like myself again. Not the widow. Not the stepmother. Judge Vivian Laurent. I am asking this court to uphold Dominic Kensington's will in full, I said clearly. Judge Blackwood nodded once. I am also requesting a formal judgment clearing my name of all allegations regarding manipulation or undue influence. Vale looked resigned already. Then I delivered the final blow. And I am requesting repayment of the $137,000 Sebastian Kensington borrowed from his father over the years, including applicable interest. The gasp in the courtroom was immediate. Vale jumped to his feet. Your Honor, that is outside the scope of. It became relevant, I interrupted calmly. The moment Sebastian accused me of financially exploiting Dominic. I looked toward the bench. I believe this court should examine all financial exploitation within this family. Judge Blackwood's expression barely changed, but I saw it. Approval. Sebastian looked shattered. Mr. Kensington, the judge said quietly, how do you respond? Sebastian wiped at his face helplessly. I can't repay that. His voice cracked badly. I don't have that kind of money. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Then perhaps you should not have treated your father like an endless bank account. No one spoke after that. Because everyone in the room understood what was ending. Not just the lawsuit. The illusion Sebastian built around himself for decades. Judge Blackwood reviewed his notes carefully for several minutes. Finally he looked up. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, I am prepared to issue a final ruling. Sebastian closed his eyes. The allegations of manipulation and undue influence are entirely unsupported by evidence. Judge Blackwood's voice sharpened slightly. In fact, they are deeply offensive to the memory of Dominic Kensington and harmful to the reputation of his widow. I saw several people in the gallery nod. Mrs. Kensington has demonstrated not only legal competence, but extraordinary personal devotion to her late husband over 2 decades of marriage. Then his attention shifted towards Sebastian. The evidence also establishes a clear pattern of financial irresponsibility on the part of Mr. Sebastian Kensington. Vale lowered his head. I therefore find fully in favor of Mrs. Kensington. Sebastian closed his eyes the moment the ruling was delivered. Dominic Kensington's will shall stand exactly as written. Sebastian looked hollow now. And Mr. Sebastian Kensington is ordered to repay $137,000 plus accrued interest. The gavel struck. Just like that, it was over. Sebastian lost the case. But more importantly, he lost the story he'd been telling himself for 20 years. The story where he was the victim. 6 months later, I stood in a corner office overlooking the city skyline. A polished brass plate beside the door read, Vivian Kensington, attorney at law. And somehow, after everything, it felt right. The trial had spread across the legal community faster than I expected. Not because of the money, because of what it represented. Within weeks, women started calling me widows, stepmothers, women dismissed for years as just wives, women who sacrificed careers, ambitions, and identities for families who later treated them as disposable. So I opened a practice again. Small at first. Mostly pro bono cases for women who couldn't afford powerful attorneys. Word spread quickly. Judge Vivian Laurent had returned, and she had very little patience left for people who underestimated women. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. My secretary stepped into the office. Mrs. Kensington, your next appointment is here. Send her in. The woman who entered looked nervous immediately. Early 60s. Elegant clothes. Hands gripping her purse tightly enough to wrinkle the leather. I recognized that look instantly. I had worn it myself walking into court months earlier. Mrs. Ashford, I said gently, please sit. She lowered herself carefully into the chair across from my desk. I'm not sure anyone can help me, she admitted quietly. They're saying terrible things about me. I folded my hands calmly. Tell me. Her eyes filled immediately. My husband passed away 3 months ago. His children are contesting the will. I already knew where this was going. They claim I manipulated him, she whispered. That I married him for money. The old anger stirred in my chest again. And what's the truth? She looked down at her trembling hands. The truth is I gave up my nursing career to help raise his daughters after their mother died. Her voice cracked. I spent 15 years taking care of that family. I listened quietly. I helped him through diabetes, heart surgery, depression after his business collapsed. Tears slid down her cheeks now. And now they're calling me a predator. I reached for my yellow legal pad. Did you keep records? I asked. She blinked. What? Medical paperwork. Financial statements. Evidence of your contributions. A tiny flicker of hope appeared in her face. Yes, she whispered. I kept everything. And just like that, I knew exactly how her story was going to end. I even kept the letters he wrote me, Mrs. Ashford said quietly. Letters thanking me for everything I sacrificed for the family. I smiled before I could stop myself. Not because her situation was sad. Because for the first time since Dominic died, I recognized the feeling again. A winnable case. Mrs. Ashford, I said, closing the folder gently. I think we're going to work very well together. An hour later she left my office standing a little straighter than when she arrived. And after the elevator doors closed behind her, I sat quietly for a moment thinking about how much my life had changed. The grief was still there. I still missed Dominic every morning. But grief no longer felt like the end of my story. It felt like something I carried while moving forward. My phone buzzed against the desk. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten immediately. Sebastian, can we talk? I've been thinking about what you said in court. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Coffee tomorrow. Velvet Ember Cafe. The next morning I arrived early and chose a table near the window. Old courtroom habit. Always position yourself where you can observe the entrance. When Sebastian finally walked in, I barely recognized him. The expensive arrogance was gone. No designer suit. No smug expression. No performance. He looked tired. Humbled. Like life had finally introduced itself properly. He spotted me and approached cautiously. "Vivi," he said softly. "Thank you for meeting me." I gestured toward the chair. "Sit down." We ordered coffee and spent several uncomfortable minutes pretending to study menus we already knew by heart. Finally, Sebastian cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." I said nothing. "I owe Dad one too," he admitted. "Though I guess I'm too late for that." There was no manipulation in his voice. No self-pity either. Just exhaustion. "That video." He swallowed hard. Watching him talk about me like that was brutal. "And what did you see?" I asked. Sebastian stared down into his coffee. "A spoiled man who spent 20 years punishing someone for loving my father." The honesty caught me off guard. "I thought you stole him from me," he continued quietly. "But the truth is, I pushed him away myself." Something softened inside me then. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of something less painful than anger. "Sebastian," I said gently, "you were 12 when your mother died." He nodded silently. "That kind of grief changes children. Sometimes permanently. But I never even tried with you," he whispered. "Not once." I remembered all the birthdays. The awkward dinners. The holidays where he barely looked at me. And somehow sitting there across from this tired man, I realized how young he had really been through all of it. "The worst part," he said, voice breaking slightly, "is realizing you never stopped trying with me." Outside the cafe window, people hurried past carrying shopping bags and coffee cups, completely unaware of the small miracle happening at our table. Two people finally telling the truth after 20 years. "What happens now?" Sebastian asked eventually. I took a sip of coffee before answering. "Now you decide who you want to become." He nodded slowly. "I got a job." That surprised me. "Doing what?" "Bookkeeping for a small accounting firm." A faint embarrassed smile crossed his face. "Nothing glamorous. But I show up on time. I do the work. Nobody there cares who my father was." For the first time in my life, I heard pride in Sebastian's voice that wasn't attached to money. "How does that feel?" I asked. "Terrifying," he admitted honestly. "And good." He rubbed his hands together nervously. "Dad always rescued me before I had to become responsible for myself." I thought about Dominic then. How many nights he stayed awake worrying Sebastian would never fully grow up. "And now?" I asked. "Now if I fail, it's my fault." He exhaled slowly. "And if I succeed, it'll actually mean something." We talked for over an hour after that. Not fixing 20 years. Just beginning. Carefully. Slowly. Like people learning a language neither of them ever properly spoke before. As we stood to leave, Sebastian hesitated near the door. "There's something else," he said quietly. I waited. "I started therapy after the trial." That didn't surprise me. I finally realized something. His eyes met mine. "I wasn't angry because Dad loved you." His voice tightened. "I was angry because you showed me what real love looked like." The words hit harder than anything he'd said in court. "I watched you take care of him when he was sick," Sebastian continued. "You always put someone else first." He shook his head slightly. And deep down, I knew I didn't know how to love people like that. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I reached for my purse. "You were a child, Sebastian. But I'm not anymore." His voice was steady now. "And if there's any chance we can become something resembling family, I'd like to try." I looked at him carefully. Really looked at him. Not the angry boy. Not the entitled man from the courtroom. Just someone finally willing to become better. "It'll take time," I said honestly. "I have time." At the door I paused before leaving. "One thing you should never doubt," I told him quietly. "Your father loved you until the very end." Sebastian's eyes filled instantly. I'm finally starting to believe that. 6 months later I stood in another courtroom. Different case. Different widow. Same cruelty. This time I represented a 72-year-old woman whose stepchildren were trying to declare her mentally incompetent to gain control of her late husband's estate. The opposing attorney looked young enough to still ask his mother how long to microwave leftovers. Confident. Smug. Certain he was about to embarrass another grieving older woman. Poor man. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I rose slowly from my opening statement and felt that familiar calm settle over me again. The strength and certainty returned almost instantly. Vivian Kensington had finally found her way back to Judge Lauren. Your Honor, I began, turning toward the gallery. This case is about more than inheritance. The room quieted immediately. It's about the dangerous assumption that a woman becomes invisible as she ages. I let my eyes move across the courtroom. That a widow's grief makes her weak. That sacrifice somehow erases intelligence. That years spent caring for others mean less than years spent building titles. Behind me in the gallery sat Mrs. Ashford, whose case we'd already won 3 months earlier. Beside her sat Mrs. Park, now one of my closest friends after spending months apologizing with casseroles and uncomfortable honesty. And in the back row sat Sebastian. Simple suit. Nervous expression. Proud smile. Family. Not the family I expected to have, but the one life built anyway through pain, truth, forgiveness, and second chances. I looked back around the courtroom. Today, I said calmly, we are going to prove exactly how wrong those assumptions are. And for the first time in a very long time, I knew without question that I was exactly where I belonged.